My name is Bruce Knotts, and I welcome everyone to the Unitarian Universalist Association office at the United Nations Parallel Panel event at the Commission on the Status of Women, CSW, Decolonizing Fast Fashion, a Living Wage and Good Working Conditions for Women of the Global South. We are here today to discuss how fast fashion as a multi-million, perhaps even a multi-billion-dollar industry that perpetuates poverty and environmental degradation in the Global South due to the overall lack of regulation and neoliberal economic policies. Our panel of sustainable fashion activists and anthropologists will hold an interactive conversation around the colonial origins of our, I just lost my text. We will discuss the ways that public and private government sectors can come together to combat cycles of poverty perpetuated by neocolonial economic relationships that oppress millions of girls and women worldwide. I would like to thank our co-sponsors, the NGO Committee on Human Rights. This event is being recorded. I would now like to introduce our fabulous Lamia Karim, who is our moderator and an intern in our office, and she's really outstanding, and she deserves a great deal of credit for putting this event together. Please welcome Lena.
Hi everyone, it's so good to see everybody's faces. My name, as Bruce stated, is Lena Yoriadis, and I am a climate justice intern at the Unitarian Universalist at the UN. We're very excited to have a panel discussion on a very important topic that doesn't get enough attention. And I'd like to introduce our first panel member, Aditi Mayer. Aditi Mayer is a sustainable fashion blogger, photojournalist, labor rights activist, and frequent speaker on topics of social and environmental justice. She also serves on the Council of Intersectional Environmentalists and will be spending 2022 as a National Geographic Digital Storytelling Fellow. So thank you, Aditi, for being here, and please welcome Aditi Mayer.
Thank you so much for having me. Should I just wait for the presentation to begin before diving right in? Awesome. So hi, everyone. My name is Aditi Mayer. Thank you, Lena, so much for the introduction. And I'm really excited to share a little bit about my journey and work in this space. So next slide, please. So 7 years ago, my relationship with fashion shifted from a practice of retail therapy to following arbitrary notions of what was in to a deeply personal exploration of my identity and engaging with the idea of decolonization. I remember my beginnings in the sustainable fashion world very clearly. It was 2013, and I was just about to begin my undergraduate career. Designs and aesthetics had always been powerful mediums for me to explore my South Asian heritage, and fashion was quickly becoming a realm to explore that as well. A few months later, the Rhona Plaza factory collapse happened. For those that are not familiar, Rhona Plaza was an 8-story garment factory in Dhaka, Bangladesh that was producing for some of the world's most well-known fast fashion names. Structural cracks were found in Rhona Plaza the day before it was collapsed. But there was so much pressure from upper management to have workers complete orders that they were called back into work the next day. The next day, Rhona Plaza framed the biggest industrial disaster of our time, one that killed more than 1,132 workers and injured over 2,500. For me, Rhona Plaza catalyzed a new understanding of fashion. No longer was fashion just about the pretty dress, it was about the politics of labor to the industry's disproportionate impact upon communities of color worldwide. But Rhona Plaza also marked a key moment in the world of the sustainable and ethical fashion sphere. So next slide, please. What came next was the exponential rise of words like sustainable or ethical fashion. And at its best, brands differentiated themselves with fair pay, transparent supply chains, and eco-friendly materials. But the other side of the sustainable fashion narrative that was on the rise was that sustainability was a movement that one had to buy into in order to engage with. So next slide, please. Key sustainable fashion platitudes like vote with your dollar field notions of not only how one could engage with the movement, but who could engage with the movement, those who could afford it. For me, as someone who came from a low-income background, the daughter of immigrants, I began to search for an understanding of sustainability beyond a narrative of consumption. Next slide, please. So for me, it was very important to question the systems and structures that set the conditions for that fateful day of Rhona Plaza to occur. Next slide. I wanted to question why ethics were a differentiator rather than a baseline in the fashion industry, why we needed a whole alternative sustainable fashion market, which meant that the traditional fashion model had largely normalized violence as part of its business model. Next slide. And so that led me to question the historical context of creating a fashion system that operated in a very colonial model. Next slide. So we went from conscious consumerism, that narrative went on the rise. And if we go to the next slide, I was more curious on how we had continued colonialism. So next slide again, please. So a lot of my work is engaging with understanding colonial practice in fashion. In the next slide, I kind of explore how I frame the idea of colonial practice, which I say is predicated on seeing the extraction and exploitation of resources, whether that's raw material to human labor, as a means for infinite growth and success. Next slide. So it's really important to note that, like many global industries, the fashion industry relies on an unequal exchange, one that's predicated on goods from the global south for consumption by the global north in the most simplified terms. But if we look a little bit more closely, the unequal exchange is the exchange of manufactured products produced at shockingly low prices due to labor that costs near nothing to be sold at higher margins. And we know this to be especially true for the fashion industry because it's largely operating on the global race to the bottom. The idea that brands scramble to produce as fast as they can, as much as they can, as cheap as they can, which often means heading to the countries that are still reeling from the impacts of colonization, making them an especially vulnerable workforce, which is often the propelling tool of exploitation. The business model in fashion largely has always headed to the cheapest parts of the world. And that's not because of better infrastructure or factories. It's largely to extract from these populations. And this is the racism built into the system. Throughout history, we've seen how false hierarchies of power, often rooted in race or histories of colonialism, have been the first steps towards dehumanizing and violence to maintain a very colonial project. If you go to the next slide, I talk a little bit about my work looking at the history of South Asia. And I think the British Raj Empire in South Asia gives a very clear example of some of the first fast fashion systems. And I'll dive in a bit more on what I mean by that in the next slide. So in 1664, the East India Company was established as the largest importer of cotton to Europe. Prior to that point of colonization, India made up 25% of the world's economy, largely through textiles and spices. And the British Empire was particularly interested in the business of textiles. So next slide. So a systemic plan was implemented to subdue the Indian textile economy and industry by coercing Indian farmers to abandon their farming of subsistence farming in favor of the cotton crop. Not only would this eventually diminish the food supply, it would subject farmers to a cycle of interest-laden debt. And so India was to constantly supply cotton that would be taken to Britain's cotton mills, the mills of Lancashire, for example. And this would be sold back to India at a premium, ensuring that the colonized remained subdued and profitable for the colonizer. India became the exporter of only raw material, and the rates at which this cotton was being sold back to the country left local spinners and weavers unable to afford the cotton required for their production in many accounts, and the extraction and destruction of artisanal industries and agricultural practices ensued because we had largely switched to a cash crop or monocrop culture with cotton. Next slide, please. So if you go one more slide over, I also want to note, it's important to note that the pattern of exploited labor that was happening around the world that positioned Britain as the workshop of the world. If we fast forward a few years, the British manufactured cloth severely undermined the Indian cotton industry during the 19th century, especially due to the speed of the US-Britain cotton system, which was predicated on the use of slave labor in America, which is important to note happened after the forced removal of indigenous folks from the land in the Americas, which is followed by the creation of cotton plantations. But because there was so much land, they now had to subjugate a whole nother population to work this land, which became cotton plantations. And so enslaved populations from Africa allowed white plantation owners in the South to garner insurmountable wealth from cotton. So it's important to note that at this point in time, we had an empire of cotton. And this exploited labor and agricultural dexterity is particularly what set the groundwork for the international fashion industry, which was America's first big business boom. So if you go to the next slide, I want to talk a little bit about how, although history shows, an empire of cotton, history also shows that local textile and fashion production can free countries from their sacrifice zones and hostage position. So during the fight for independence from the British Raj, one of the biggest tools that India kind of honed in on was the Khadi movement, also known as the Swadeshi or Made in India movement. And during this time, people began to boycott the cloth manufactured industrially in Britain. They would burn it, refuse to buy it, and they promoted the spinning of khadi. Khadi is a cotton indigenous to India. It's like a rough textile that people spin by hand. And khadi, or this sort of cotton, was often grown in people's yards as part of the subsistence farming model. And that became a way to promote rural self-employment, self-reliance, and divestment from the colonial empire. And so if we go to the next slide, I want to talk a little bit about movements of reimagination. But before I dive into that, I think it's important to note that oftentimes we talk about colonialism through the lens of being a distant abstraction, a practice of the past. But it's really important to note the practices that up until very recently are continuing to perpetuate countries to follow specific models that really go against land-based knowledge, indigenous practices, localized economies. So some things I will touch on in the interest of time is it's really important that we understand structural adjustments. Give me 1 second. So in the 80s and 90s, there was a series of countries throughout what we know as the global South that had recently established their formal independence from colonialism. And during this time, a lot of them were taking loans from the World Bank and the IMF in what we now know as the period that was called the Dictatorship of Debt. During this time, the conditions and conditionalities were set that countries had to follow certain economic zones that were void of economic regulations, labor unionization, and other practices that made them hotbeds for exploitation. And one of the first countries to undergo structural adjustment was Bangladesh. And so when we talk about sweatshops and Bangladesh being a hotbed for these sort of things, it's really important to know that there are a lot of institutions and histories at play that set the conditions for that to take place. So I'm not going to dive into that too much, but now I'm going to talk a little bit about my work in practice and what that looks like to reimagine the fashion industry. So if you go to the next slide, this is one of my images from my work as a photojournalist. A lot of my work for the greater half of the last 4 years has been working in downtown LA and organizing alongside the garment worker community here. So Los Angeles' second biggest industry is actually the cut and sew garment industry. It employs upwards of 50,000 individuals, a figure that is largely a gross underestimation of how many workers there actually are. And that's because the garment industry in LA is a largely underground and informal economy. Most workers are paid by the piece rate, which means they're paid per piece they make as opposed to the hour. A piece rate that's often as low as 2 to 3 cents. So the average wage in LA is somewhere around $5 to $6, taking the piece rate into account. Next slide, please. And so one thing I wanted to touch on is what garment worker resistance looks like. In the sustainable fashion sphere, we talk a lot about ideas like corporate social responsibility, which is a great concept, but corporate social responsibility is often framed by voluntary measures by the brand that often mirror or reflect local law, and there's a lack of auditing processes. I'm really interested in the idea of worker-driven social responsibility or worker-driven sustainability. And currently, history is being made in LA because garment workers have come together to reimagine policy. And one of those things is through the Garment Worker Protection Act. So this Protection Act would essentially eliminate the piece rate and ensure that the minimum wage is being followed for the garment worker scene. It would create a direct line of accountability from factory to brand to retailers, so brands can avoid blaming the factory, and factories will blame the brand. And in this image that I photographed here, this was from a protest against Ross Dress for Less, where 4 members of the Garment Workers Center were collectively owed $800,000 in unpaid wages from Ross. This was not an accusation, it was a case they won in the labor court, but they avoided accountability by blaming the factory. So the Garment Worker Protection Act would address accounts like these. Next slide, please. One more. And another example of the type of organizations that kind of frame my work are Oshadi Collective and Keti Virasat Mission. These are 2 organizations and brands based out of India that are very much looking at the impacts that the Green Revolution had in India. So a quick lesson with that: in the 60s and 70s, in India, specifically in Punjab, farmers were forced into practices of monocropping, use of pesticides, and I'm not going to dive too deep in that. But essentially, there is a movement in India to revive the charkha, the spinning wheel that kind of framed the khadi movement that I talked about, as well as farmers that are returning to indigenous practices that are rooted in native varieties to their landscapes, and kind of divesting from industrial models of agriculture that are all tied to the fashion industry in many ways. Next slide. So for me, the idea I want to kind of conclude on that, for me, sustainability is always an interrogation of power. In the next slide, I touch on the fact that in our work with sustainability, we need to challenge the status quo and look at the ways that we can take power from those at the top and build power from the bottom up. Next slide. With this lens, my work looks on how to reorient our relationship with land, labor, and fashion. In the next slide, with my focus on land specifically, we need to think about the ways we can learn to nature-based solutions, thinking about building localized textile and fashion economies. And in many ways, the land aspect of sustainability is not about reinventing the wheel. The wisdom and knowledge is largely there. We just need to learn how to hone in on that. Next slide. On the labor element, I'm always thinking about how do we build workers' power and divest from this idea of a system predicated on speed and scale at all costs, one that comes at the cost of quality, the environment, but also garment worker lives, as we saw with Rhona Plaza. And lastly, next slide, please. My understanding of fashion is always the marriage of how we view land and labor. So I hope that we could take that framing into this panel. And so I'll stop there, and thank you so much for having me. And I hope that this short history lesson and a nutshell of my work can engage with the question of how do we decolonize fashion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Aditi. You did an amazing job squeezing in such an important history lesson. And I had no idea that garment workers in LA were only making $6. That is mind-blowing. So thank you for bringing that up as well. And with that being said, we are going to hear a perspective from our next panel member, Professor Lamia Karim. Professor Lamia Karim is a cultural anthropologist at the University of Oregon. She works on women and development. She recently finished a book manuscript, Remnants of Capital, Work and Love Among Garment Workers in Bangladesh, which is based on 6 years of research. So now that we've learned about the colonial origins of our international fashion industry, we're going to take a look into a more micro level at the individual people and the actual garment workers and women and girls that are being exploited within the fashion industry. So with that being said, thank you, Professor Lamia. You're muted? I think you're muted.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Oh, what is it? Unmute myself. I have done that. Okay. Well, thank you to Aditi, our first speaker, for giving this very broad landscape of colonialism and the textile industry. I'm waiting for Rob to sort of put on my first slide. Okay. So Bangladesh is the second largest apparel producing country after China. By 2011, it had reached that status. It started in 1978 with South Korean capital investment, and that was a result of the multi-fiber agreement that disallowed countries, middle income countries like South Korea at that time, to enter US markets. So what happened was that South Korean companies were looking to source their clothes from a country like Bangladesh, where labor was extremely cheap, but was also allowed to export to countries like the United States and EU countries. So that's how it occurred. And as mentioned by Aditi, that Bangladesh went into early neoliberal development policies under the military dictatorship in 1975. And the garment industry grew slowly initially, but it was an unregulated industry. Basically, it was left to the capitalists to decide what was going on. The government did not interfere. Labor unions were not disallowed, but they made it very difficult for labor unions to operate and organize workers. And wages were extremely low, the lowest in the world. And the factory conditions, as you know, now after the Rana Plaza accident, was horrific. I came to this work actually from 2013, right after the collapse of the Tazreen factory fire in Bangladesh, which happened 4 months before the Rana Plaza. In the Tazreen factory fire, workers were locked inside the factory by managers, so they could not leave, and a fire started, and many of the workers burned to death, about 112 of them. This has not received as much attention as the 2013 Rana Plaza collapse, because the spectacular collapse of the factory and the death of so many workers. In fact, it's the largest industrial accident since the 1909, I think, factory fire in the garment industry in New York. Let's go to the next slide, please. Now, who are these garment workers in Bangladesh, right? The workforce is about 4 million. 80% of the workforce is young rural women between the ages of 15 to 35. It's very difficult to find workers over that age. When I asked my research colleagues, why do I not see older women? Because 35 is a pretty young age to exit out of the factory. And they said, well, that's an interesting question. We really do not know. And that's what really brought me to this study of not only looking at younger workers, but also older workers. What happens to workers after they leave? And their work life, as I write out here, you can see it's about 20 years, right? And as you know, women, because of their reproductive functions and care responsibilities, often exit in and out of the workforce. So it's really a short workforce, but they are out of it, and or they are, what I would say, forced out of it by factory management because they're considered to be not as productive as younger workers. Most of the women work as seamstresses or sewing operators. And in the past, before 2013, they had helpers, a younger junior worker, an entry-level worker who would help them as they're sewing with, giving them buttons, helping them with different pieces that they need as they're sewing the clothes. Wages in 2013 were at $30, a global low. It has slowly climbed up to $90 in December 2018, but it has not kept at pace with cost of living increases. And there's a constant back and forth between workers' rights groups and workers asking and demanding better pay and also better work and living conditions. The management in these factories is primarily male. And so there is a gender dynamic that you see between the workers who are female, poor, mostly with very low levels of literacy, and male management who are seen as more middle class, more educated. So there's not only a gender dynamic, but there's a class dynamic through which workers are disciplined. There's always the threat of losing jobs. And if you go to garment factories in Bangladesh, you will see that there are always many workers outside the factory looking for work. So there's also a question of demand and supply. One thing you should know, as we are also discussing, how do we decolonize fast fashion, how do we improve workers' conditions, is that what were the options available to these women? The options were very few. Most of the rural women who came to work in the city prior to the garment industry expanding in the 90s and especially in the 2000s worked primarily as domestic workers in middle-class homes. Okay, so there were not too many options available to these women. The garment industry in that sense has given them some autonomy, some status. They feel very proud about being women who work and they can earn, and I can talk about that more later. One thing to notice is that workers suffer from chronic health problems, and I've written it all down, as you can see, and that is an ongoing issue. It has been addressed, but more in seminars than in really addressing to improve the health conditions. And part of what would improve their work conditions or their health conditions is to give them more better wages so they can eat better. Another thing to remember is that most of these women are a conduit to capital for their families. So if a unmarried daughter comes to the city to work, a lot of her money goes back to support her family in the villages. So often the women are not eating very well. They are transferring a lot of their money, the paycheck from their paycheck back to support their families. So it's a complex story. It's not a simple story. And our solutions also have to take all these aspects into consideration. Next slide, please. Now, Bangladesh is ground zero for fast fashion due to its low wages, right? And also very, I would say it's largely a disciplined workforce. What do I mean by that? Does that mean that Bangladeshi workers are not demanding higher wages? They are. Every time there has been a wage increase in Bangladesh has been a result of workers coming out onto the streets demanding higher wages, talking about the oppression they see within the factory and and outside of the factory. So it is that they speak out, but the thing is that the industry is big and the industry is dispersed, and so it's very hard to organize the workers as a group of working class women all together fighting. Globally, there are more than 100 billion garments that are manufactured annually, and less than 1% is made up of recycled materials. And it's a very carbon intensive industry, producing between 4 to 10% of carbon emissions, but that depends on how you calculate it. But definitely, recently, a lot of attention has been brought to the garment industry in terms of how it is, destroying the environment, the process of extracting raw materials like oil for synthetic fibers, or cotton, then shipping them around the world, and this is part of a global supply chain, is extremely carbon intensive. and is one reason that the fast fashion industry is responsible for so much carbon emissions. You have to recognize another thing, that the workers in Bangladesh are not really linked to the textile industry in Bangladesh. That's a very small industry, it's very specialized. These women do not come from families where the parents are engaged in producing textiles. They are from agrarian backgrounds, and they come to the city because their families have lost land due to river erosion. So that's also climate change, or to rural indebtedness. And they really don't come to the city with any knowledge of how to even sew or stitch. So it's important to keep that in your mind as we're talking about it. Okay, next slide, please. Now, what is fast fashion? Fast fashion is changing your fashions every 6 to 8 weeks. This has been something that has been a relatively new industry trend. And because you have workers who are desperately in need for work and money, you are able to extract enormous amount of capital from them. There's tremendous strain on workers' bodies because they have to work so hard. One of the things that happened after 2013 was that when wages were raised from $30 to $67 after the Rana Plaza factory collapse, that factory management increased the number of pieces that workers had to finish per day from 60 to 120. But they also, in many of the factories, removed the helpers that the workers had. So now the workers had to do all the work themselves, and they were told, this is your daily quota. And if you could not finish your quota on time, that meant you were not a productive worker. This is, so the failure to finish their quota required workers to stay behind on their own time. They were not getting overtime for finishing the 120 pieces of units that were a garment that they were supposed to do. So that too had a tremendous effect on the workers, not only just physical stress, but mental stress. And that is something we don't talk enough about. What are the effects on mental health for these workers who are constantly struggling to make ends meet? Next slide, please. Another area is, of course, industrial pollution. Most of the workers live in factories that have grown around the, slums around the factories. And if you go to these slums, they're makeshift slums, and they often release, the air quality is pretty poor, noxious fumes, the water quality is poor, many of the factories release toxins from washing the clothing, etc., into the nearby drains and water bodies. And Bangladesh, as you know, is a low-lying country at the forefront of climate change. And it has annual floods, and areas often get flooded. So you have effluents and everything mixing in, and they come into these slums. Of course, I don't know what level of the toxins, etc., are from factory, effluents and other environmental things that are going on, because there are many there are ancillary, factories that grow around the large garment industry factories. So I would suggest that we need more testing of the soil, groundwater, air quality in these areas, and not enough has been done. But I've spoken to workers about their living situation, and they complain about frequent headaches, respiratory problems. They say that the environment in the slums is very poor quality. Okay, let's next slide, please. So I want to come to this one question that is always on my mind, because this is that I'm not talking about a ban. I do not want to see a ban, because not only these women's lives, these 4 million plus women's lives, but also their families' lives are entangled with this industry. And if you talk to the women, you find that all of them that I have spoken with want to invest in their children's education. They want their children to have a better life. They don't want their children to become garment workers. And all these things are, bundled together. Their lives are to some degree better. They have some limited practical freedoms, ability to move around, make some choices, etc. So what we need, as Aditi also mentioned, is demand better manufacturing practices. And so we should move from fast fashion to sustainable fashion, and fashion that really works with recycling materials. We also need to work with local and global organizations for change. So there are a few names that I have put up at the global level that I know of, and then local level, Karmojibi Nari workers, rights groups. These are in Bangladesh, then Bangladesh environmental lawyers, association Bella, Nijerakori, feminist women's organization that work with women, trying to work for social justice. Next slide, please. So what can consumers do? As you know, I'm a professor. I talk to my students about it, and that's one of the questions they always ask me. Okay, professor, you've told us this story. What can we do? You can do a lot. You can adopt ethical buying choices. You can demand to know from the global retailers where they source their clothes from. Once consumers start talking, I can tell you that the retailers will respond. So reject fast fashion. Ask yourself every time you go into H&M, why is this, dress so cheap? Who made it, right? There is a story behind that dress. And also there is a person or several, people and their families, hopes and dreams entangled with that. Demand living wages for workers in the South, form an alliance. And of course, demand transparency from retail buyers. Ask them who are they sourcing their clothes from, what are the factory and workers conditions where they source their clothes from. And once you start doing this, I can guarantee you that the retail, global retailers will start responding, because there is a question here. I mean, there's a relationship here between demand and supply. So if you didn't have the demand for fast fashion, the supply wouldn't be there. The moment you start containing that demand, your supply will shrink too. But at the same time, remember that all of us wear clothes with labels from all over the world. And so we are all connected together, right? And so in rejecting fast fashion, which I ask you to do not reject the labor and the dreams of these women. Let's be allies. Let's try to work for a more ethical, just, and environmentally sound world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Lamia Karim, for sharing your research and your experiences with being on the ground with garment workers and women intertwined within the garment industry. One thing that you said that really stuck with me is that when you talked with these women, they said that they don't want their children to be garment workers as they are. And I think that that says a lot about the practice. So with that being said, let's go to our next panel member, Sophia Li. Sophia Li is a Chinese-American multimedia journalist, film director, and climate optimist. She has worked on projects like a short documentary on the biggest landfill in the US in partnership with the United Nations and environmental nonprofit Slow Factory. Sophia's journalistic reporting has appeared in CNN, Vogue, and the United Nations. So thank you, Sophia.
Thank you, Lena. Hello, everyone. So before we get started, I think it's really important to, I'm going to be talking a lot about the Stop Asian Hate movement and how that relates to the Global South, and also how fashion is a feminist issue. I think these issues and everything we've talked about have what we're trying to do, what Aditi has said and Dr. Lema has said, is that we're trying to humanize these workers. And I think the best way to do that is first to get back in touch with ourselves. So I'm just going to lead us through a quick 3-breath meditation. So this information can seem a little bit more resonating in human eyes. So if you would please join me wherever you are, and closing your eyes. And we're going to have your feet be firmly planted in the ground, and your palms can either be facing up to receive energy or palms facing down to feel more grounded. And we're just going to do a big inhale through our nose and exhale through our mouth. We're going to inhale for 3 counts here and exhale for 6 counts. Inhale for 4 counts. Exhale for 8 counts. Inhale for 5 counts through your nose. Exhale for 10 counts. And then you could come back and join me whenever you're ready. So I'm going to first start off by talking about how fashion is a feminist issue. So we've talked, like Aditi and Dr. Lema has explained a lot about what happened in the Rhona Plaza factory. And there's basically 3 reasons why largely fashion is a feminist issue. So the first one is the economic impact. So according to UN Women, actually, women's economic power sets a direct path towards gender equality. But 3% of garments retail price makes its way into the brands of the workers who produced it. So fast fashion, low prices have a direct impact on the continued poverty, discrimination, and exploitation in the global South directly for the women and children who are women as well. And the majority of garment workers earn less than $3 a day. So in the UK, for example, in 2020, Boohoo, which is a fast fashion retailer, discovered that the paying workers just made $3.50 an hour. And Boohoo actually had an increase of about, it was an increase about 10% of sales during the pandemic. So they actually increased. And according to the labor behind the label, 80% of garment workers are women aged 18 to 35. Many have families, and in Bangladesh specifically, they make about $97 per month. So that's the economic impact part of how fashion is a feminist issue. The second part is the environmental impact. So it's entirely unregulated. I think a lot of the times what's the hardest about over this past summer, there was a lot of talk about the Uyghurs and the cotton supply that Uyghurs were providing the majority of the cotton supply to big fashion labels, everything from Nike to Adidas, Ralph Lauren, et cetera, Calvin Klein. But a lot of times these companies didn't even know about their production supply chain because of subcontractors. So the environmental impact is both a human rights and a planet rights issue. So according to Global Citizen, heat waves, droughts, also rising sea levels, and extreme storms disproportionately affect women. As we know, the climate crisis is already here. It's just not evenly distributed, as Celine Simon says. And a large part is that because working age women, 23% are more likely to live in extreme poverty in the global South. The global North also is, as we know, contributes to more than 71% of the GHG greenhouse gas emissions, but then the global South experiences the majority of this. So the environmental impact is that women are more vulnerable to the hazards of the climate change. They rely more on agriculture for their income instead of currency in their local base. Like maybe they'll use their local agriculture as a bartering system. So that impacts them more, have less access to stable food and housing, and are less likely to just move around and be and have the migration available. And then also there's, of course, the third one, which is the emotional effect. For garment workers, abuse, violence, and harassment are a major part of their daily working conditions. Reports by the Global Labor Justice in 2018 found that more than 540 workers at factory supply major high street retailers described incidents of threats and abuse. So I think a lot of times we talk about like the physical part and the economic part of the garment workers there, like they're being exploited for their labor. There's children exploitation. There's also the environmental impact, but a lot of times we don't think about the emotional impact that comes and the trauma and the PTSD that comes from the collapse at Rana Plaza, but also just like the daily threats and abuse that happens at these factories where they have no unionized, they have no union, they have no rights to reporting these injustices. And oftentimes these women just have to bear these emotional labor by themselves. So the physical labor, yes, but the emotional labor, I think we don't talk enough about. And that's something that is then also passed down to generations. As we found in Cambodia, that was like the first time that PTSD was able to be scientifically proven. So this is the emotional trauma of these workers are then passed down to their families. Also, the gender-based violence in factories is large part down. It contributes from the quick turnaround and lead times and low overheads, and also an increasing desire for fast fashion. And the women are always the one who take the biggest emotional and physical ground for that. So those are the three reasons why fashion is largely a feminist issue, with a large emphasis on the emotional impact of these women. And I think what the hardest thing about the emotional impact and the research around this is that we can study, there's research and stats, and we can study about how much money they're making, but it's really hard to track the emotional statistics of these women and to gain insights into this, because one, a lot of these women do not want to go on record and talk about it. Two, they haven't had the right mental health resources to even communicate what they're experiencing. Three, they're minimizing this pain or this emotional labor because they think that they have to just continue on with this role and job and never had a safe space to even communicate the emotional part of it. Because a lot of times the emotional part is the hardest to process compared to the physical part. And then I'm going to go into the anti-Asian racism that's happening right now. There was a huge skyrocket during the pandemic, a 1,300% increase, and Stop AAPI Hate has reported 4,000 incidents of Stop Asian Hate just in Western countries. So what I think the conversation we haven't talked about when it comes to this movement of Stop Asian Hate is that the billion-dollar empires and companies who built their products and profits using labor from the global South, especially the women. I'm talking about the Amazon, the Gaps, the Samsungs, the BMWs, the Nikes and Adidas as well, like you name it. They especially need to be speaking out on Stop Asian Hate because they've benefited their entire supply chain and economic system based off of labor that comes from the global South, women from the global South. When we talk about Stop Asian Hate, we're not just talking about physical assault, hate crimes in the middle of the street, or we're not talking about just mass shooting, but we're also talking about these labor rights that needs to happen. If any of these companies, sportswear, technology, like car companies, like they all contribute so much of their success to the labor of the global South. And none of these companies have spoken up about specifically Stop Asian Hate and within their own company that they have so much control over. So I want to leave everyone with that is something to consider, is that when we're buying products, yes, we're not just thinking about the fast fashion products, like that's an easy turnaround to switch over from, fast fashion to slow fashion, but also these other companies that we regularly buy from, Amazon, largest increase of profits during the pandemic. What are we contributing when we buy from Amazon? Yes, it's convenient, and yes, it's like the easiest access point, but when we say stop Asian hate, we also mean the labor exploitation that comes within the own supply chain of these companies. So thank you so much, and I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Sophia. Thank you for the meditation. That was, we don't often think, especially within these past few weeks with the rise of API hate, it can be overwhelming. So thank you for that. And yeah, that you bring up a really good point about how the fashion industry and fashion is a feminist issue, and it's often not brought up about the interdependence of international corporations that profit from exploiting women and girls in the global South. So thank you for bringing that up. And we are going to move to our next panel member, Sandra Niessen. Sandra Niessen is an anthropologist focused on Indigenous clothing and textile traditions. Recent publications explore impacts of the global fashion system on Indigenous traditions. Her article, Fashion, Its Sacrifice Zone and Sustainability, is published in Fashion Theory.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Lena. Thank you, Bruce Knotts, and thank you as well to the Unitarian Universalist Association. I'm so pleased to see this conversation happening here today. It's so important. I'm also thrilled to see how many people in our audience today, welcome all of you, are so enthusiastically participating in the chat. It's great to have this interaction because a lot of you are responding from your own life experience, and that's terribly important that we're getting this mix of voices. So I hope you continue to avidly participate in the chat. If I could have my first slide, please, Rob. It's just a title slide and introduce, okay, that's the second one. Yeah, thank you. The title today is A Living Wage and Good Working Conditions for Women of the Global South in connection with decolonizing fast fashion. And I'd like to make the argument, and I see that all of my colleagues today who've talked before me agree with parts of my argument. My argument is that decolonizing fast fashion has certainly to do with a living wage and good working conditions, but that fashion justice can only be achieved if we approach this issue much more widely. So that's why I talk about sacrifice zones, and I'd like to talk about them in relation to fast fashion. Could we have the next slide, please, Rob? Here's a sacrifice zone for you, and it's one that probably everybody knows, the tar sands of Alberta, where I spent many years of my life. Land destroyed by exploitation. In this case, mining, but also can occur from plantations and lumbering, any kind of exploitation that destroys the land. In fact, the word was first coined in relation to nuclear fallout. And the people with their fingers on the button use the term sacrifice zones as a way to sort of cordon off those areas that it was legitimate to be able to sacrifice for the sake of the war effort. And since then, it's also been used in relation to chemical pollution and so forth, which permanently destroys land. The very invention of this term suggests that this kind of destruction of the earth began to be thinkable and condoned. Sacrifice zones are generated by our extraction economy, and lots of us have talked about that today. And that's a primary feature of colonialism and of its daughter or son, capitalism. And it's symptomatic of relations between the global North and the global South. The wealth that is extracted for the global North and the consequences for the global South are generally ignored. So the term sacrifice zones places a focus on geographic areas, tracts of land. It normalizes the idea that parts of the earth are disposable and dispensable. And so you can see a parallel here between capitalism and war. Government and industry both claim the power and the right to determine those zones that can be sacrificed for the sake of economic gain for the benefit of the rich. Next slide, please, Rob. The other direction. So there we go. I'd like to look at the notion of sacrifice zones a little bit more broadly, because it leaves out, just by looking at tracts of land and geographic areas, it leaves out the issue of biological diversity. It's like it's not even worth mentioning, fully expendable. And it also leaves out the issue of people living on that land. And on the land of the tar sands, that's the Cree people. And of course, there was tremendous resistance to their land being destroyed in this way. And the Canadian government treated their resistance as illegal. And it failed eventually. Obviously, the tar sands are huge. So in other words, cultural diversity is also considered expendable for the sake of industrial expansion. So to use another war term, that's collateral damage. Decolonial theorists would call this conceptual erasure, that collateral damage is just kind of shoved under the rug. So summing up, sacrifice zones are constructed on ecocide, genocide, and racism. They're accepted, condoned, ignored, and erased. So that's by way of background. And I'd like to show that the fast fashion system is built on exactly this foundation. Could I have the next slide, please, Rob? In the first place, we've already heard this from Aditi and also from Professor Lamia Karim, that the fast fashion industry makes use of sacrifice zones for the production of cotton, through agribusiness, through the production of synthetic fibers, through fossil fuels. I read a statistic on the internet about 7 billion barrels being needed for producing the synthetic fibers for our clothes right now, with enormous expansion planned for the future, more than double. Those are old statistics. I'm sure the amount is now already much greater. The second thing that the fashion industry makes use of when it comes to sacrifice zones, and we've been talking about this all day, it's the focus of today, that is displaced people for cheap labor. The ranks of displaced people is swelling rapidly. Think of climate change, war, sacrifice zones, land degradation in general. There's a global report on internal displacement that I recommend everybody look at, because it's rather frightening to see how the ranks of displaced peoples is swelling. And of course, that's where the garment industry is getting its laborers. I don't know what percentage constitutes displaced persons. I was very pleased to hear Professor Lamia Karim talk about this, but it's probably extremely high. We need to ask, and she said this too, what has gone on in their lives that they're willing to accept the slavery of garment manufacturing. There's just not been enough research on this. And if there are students with us today, I encourage you to consider this for a future research project. There's a larger systemic whole that we have to bring into view, not just the immediate issues of wages and working conditions. I argue that focusing exclusively on wages and working conditions is a form of conceptual erasure. Fast fashion is complicit in the production, use, expansion, and condoning of sacrifice zones, and this is part and parcel of the systemic capitalist exploitation. Think of the campaign Fun Fashion Revolution, Who Made My Clothes? You see the picture here at the bottom of the slide. It tries to give a face to the garment workers, but I argue that it falls vastly short of really telling anything about the garment workers, because the campaign is operating within the system of those conceptual erasures, characteristic of consumers in the global north and of our current thinking about fast fashion. Garment workers, the very term, narrows these people down to elements in an economic system, stripped of their other human features except an individual face. Laborers accept slavery, and we've heard this already today, because they need money, because they're poor. But that's far too easy. The more complete answer has to look at, why are they poor? Why, and how is fast fashion taking advantage of the capitalist destruction of their homes and livelihoods, degradation of their land? The reasons for the desperation of garment workers has to figure in our discussion about garment workers. Could I have the next slide, please? My argument in the next slide is that the fast fashion industry is also creating sacrifice zones. During my anthropological fieldwork in Indonesia, I have seen the decline of indigenous clothing systems everywhere. When young women leave their villages to go work in factories, they leave behind their families, their cultures, their language, their customs, their traditions, and their clothing traditions. When you perceive the complexity of the making of a piece of clothing in their own culture, and in my own work, I look at weaving, it quickly becomes clear that the age-old, extremely sophisticated, culturally embedded skills, as in weaving, are being lost to do mind-numbing, unfulfilling work. As garment workers, they become de-skilled. Their cultural talents and skills are wasted. And it's horrible to see that. It's really painful to see women de-skilling themselves so they can make a little bit, a very little bit of money. COVID-19 has also shown that the women who do this work are as dispensable as the clothing they make. The World Bank has said that 40% of the clothes they make end up in the landfill unworn. This is demoralizing and spirit killing. They're preyed upon in factory settings. We've heard that today too, by male bosses and management in general, and poor pay and bad working conditions is an example of that. Their humanity is being dispensed with, and they're being wasted and destroyed. And their cultures are being drained. And this is a part of the conceptual erasure that it never gets talked about. The loss of ethnic diversity is a global crisis that is not receiving as much attention as, say, the environmental crisis. Cultural loss includes the disappearance of worldviews of indigenous and local clothing systems, and that includes designs, techniques, styles, intangible cultural heritage. It includes local knowledge systems about the local environment, clothing systems that fit into the local environment. We're making use of tremendous knowledge of the local environment. The destruction of identity through the loss of culture, and simultaneously, therefore, the erosion of social and political stability. All of this is creating time bombs, social time bombs. Significantly, when it comes to textile heritages, women are the predominant keepers. So to summarize, fast fashion is not only operating in, supporting and depending on fast sacrifice zones, it's also expanding them as aiding, abetting, and benefiting from and creating sacrifice zones. By conceiving of women just as workers, we're helping to conceptually erase all of these other cultural and existential sacrifices that are being made for the sake of fast fashion. And there's a boomerang effect. Makers of sacrifice zones are in the end sabotaging themselves. The production of sacrifice zones, we already know this, is self-annihilation, and that's what we're doing on a global scale, slow suicide. On the scale of fashion, through cultural destruction this way, fast fashion is losing the designs, the techniques, the styles produced by indigenous peoples. Fast fashion has always relied on indigenous sources of inspiration. There's studies being done on this. So to be eliminating these social systems is also shooting itself in the foot. Similarly, fast fashion is destroying possibilities for future fashion developments. Sustainable fashion needs to become more local, even just to reduce the energy footprint from transportation that we've heard about from our other speakers today. Sustainability also requires that we have a more intimate relationship with our clothing so that it's not throwaway. It needs association with culture and history, intimate association, strong association with culture and history so that it's precious. And this is found in most indigenous clothing systems, but they're being destroyed by the fast fashion system precisely at this time when we need new models of how our fashion system needs to be reformed. Our need for healthy, culturally vibrant women in the global South, I argue, is far greater than our need for them as demoralized, wage-earning factory workers making our clothes that we're mostly throwing away. We need a fashion system that does not destroy, but that nurtures people and planet. And I think Aditi was getting at this in her talk. It requires healthy relations with the near environment. The fast fashion system is making this impossible for all peoples on the planet. So clearly an example of self-sabotage, if I ever heard one. We need the women that we're sacrificing to show us the way. Failing to recognize their value is self-sabotage. Unless we place the issues of wage and workplace in a larger context, we won't achieve fashion justice and the well-being of garment workers. We'll be Sisyphus, eternally rolling that rock uphill because the capitalist system is based on growth. And so the expansion of that labor pool and the growth of the economic system means that in fighting for labor improvement for these people, we'll just be Sisyphus eternally rolling the rock uphill. That's the end of my talk today. I have more to say, but we'll come to the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sandra. And thank you so much for bringing up this important topic of sacrifice zones. And you bring up a really good point about, even within the title of this panel event, good working conditions and fair wage. That is only a crumb of the exploitative nature of the fashion industry, and that can be an entry point into improving the lives of women and girls of the global South. But there's a lot more that needs to be done besides just working conditions and fair wages. And sustainable fashion needs to take that into account, and we can do that through local sustainable fashion and that encourages artisan and traditional craft work so that we don't lose these important ethnic traditions and cultures. So now we're going to move on to the Q&A session. So a really pressing question that I see popping up throughout the chat is, what can we do? So I'm going to ask the panel members. Sorry. As the conversation around sustainable and ethical fashion grows and people are becoming more receptive, are you seeing an equally powerful shift in their willingness to change their behaviors and publicly advocate for women in the global South? In what areas can the consumer do more to educate themselves and be powerful advocates?
How would you like us to approach this, Lena? Just jump in, or would you like to assign people to answer?
That's a good question. So this is like a two-part question. So perhaps I believe Professor Lamia Karim, the beginning part around the conversation around sustainable fashion and ethical fashion grows and people are becoming more receptive. Are you seeing an equally powerful shift in their willingness to change their behaviors and publicly advocate for women in the global South? Would you like to take that on, and then everybody can jump in and with their input?
Sure. Can you hear me? Okay, sure. Thank you. Definitely because of the bad press that Rhona Plaza brought to the industry, there is a lot more interest now in having engagement with, what do we do, right? It's sort of the great modernist question, what is to be done? And there are two parts to it. One is that, yes, factories are being better regulated. And I'm talking about Bangladesh because of what happened here, and it became the front page of all the newspapers and TV screens all over the world. There is definitely an interest and also an involvement in improving the work conditions, regulating the industry, allowing the trade unions to actively participate in building and training workers, right? Workers have to know what their rights are. And these workers were working between 12 to 14 hours shifts often, especially during, the peak seasons. So they had very little time to go and, to some trade union training session. So that has occurred. There is, but I'm also skeptical about how much of it is just window dressing and how much of it is real. And for that to really occur, I would say that you need to have more engagement with local grassroots level workers' organization and human rights organizations, both locally and globally, right? So, people in Bangladesh, in Vietnam, in Sri Lanka can connect with somebody like Aditi here, and so we need these exchanges, right? And you cannot expect the women to be doing this or working in these factories, but for those of us who are consumers. For consumers, that's a harder question because our, how we consume and how we wear clothes has changed so much in the last, 50 years or so. So we need to become better educated. And there's something I didn't point out in my talk, but I want to bring it to the attention of everybody. There are two types of manufacturing industries. One is the factory that can be regulated, and in Bangladesh they have these. They had after 2013 they were implemented some trade agreements so that factories were brought up to par with international standards, ILO standards. But then there's the outsourcing industry. Each factory has a shadowy outsourcing industry, and that is under radar. And that's where you have a lot of exploitation, child labor, horrific conditions, and you will never know who they are unless you are inside the factories. You're an investigative journalist or you're an anthropologist who's hanging around, right, to find out where they're sourcing the overflow of work. Fast fashion again. We need 100,000 or 50,000 jeans made within 2 weeks. So part of it goes out. A lot of the sequin work, special kind of, work that's done in clothes are also outsourced. That is unregulated. So my response to consumers, and I saw that several times, what can we do is, educate yourself. I think activists like Aditi and Sophia, they have a big role to play in bringing it to the fore. But a lot of information now is available online. And one of the things I ask my students to do, and I think many in the audience can do, I tell them just one of their projects is to go and find out what they have purchased where it was manufactured. And it took them some time. That's a class project. And they found out that A, it was very difficult to find out where it came from. B, you can find it out if you, dig deep enough. And C, they were horrified once they found out where it came from and the conditions of the workers in those factories. So I think it's linked. And one last thing I want to mention here quickly is that we are just talking about the workers in these factories globally and the retailers. The government in these countries are also complicit. And there's a capitalist class that's in these countries that is very exploitative. You cannot rule them out. It has to be brought into the conversation.
Thank you for your input. I just wanted to add in really quick with the question on what can consumers do. That, as Aditi stated earlier, that we are more than just consumers. We're global citizens. So don't feel, this is to the panel members, don't feel like you have to talk just about the consumer perspective, but also the global citizen perspective, and just as a person, a human being that has concern for the environment and people.
Could I spring in here, Lena? I think it's really important that we change the language related to the fashion system. And that's because the language we currently use incorporates a lot of erasures. It steers us away from connecting the dots. And I'm thinking in connection with fast fashion, we talk about the fashion system. And of course, it's dominant and it is global, but it is not the fashion system. It is a fashion system. And it's important to recognize that every single group of people, culture in the world has had its own fashion system. And these fashion systems have been eroded by the current dominant capitalist fashion system, which is supported by big capital. And that's why it's gained its dominance. So even by using the word the fashion system, we're disempowering our students, because there can be recognition that this fashion system that we've created is our creation. And in fact, it can be changed. It can even be thrown overboard. And there are alternatives out there. The same thing with our economic system. It's not the economic system, although it looks like it. We've created it. We can change it. We need to change it for the sake of sustainability. So other language usage such as garment workers, that's another term that blinds us to the fact that they're a whole lot more than garment workers. And that whole lot more brings us into the whole realm of what is being sacrificed when they're just garment workers in our eyes. I often think of also this notion of the supply chain. I think of it in terms of the chain gang, actually. I think of a sort of a nucleus in the form of a factory with all these chains going outward from it, connecting people to that factory, which is, the needs of the global north, the wealthy global north and wealthy people. And the problem is those chains, and in a really radical fashion justice world, those chains are broken so that those people can go back to creating their own fashions, building their own cultures instead of contributing to ours here in the global north.
Yeah, and if I can jump in on that. So I see a lot of questions regarding like consumers, what actions, and I'm really glad you brought that up, Lena, about the idea of seeing ourselves beyond the framing of just a consumer, but an active citizen. In terms of low-hanging fruit of what people can do, someone in the comments is talking about quality over quantity, how we choose to kind of frame our understanding of consumption that requires a cognitive shift. I'm seeing comments about buying secondhand, which is great, making clothes yourself, buying less, swapping. But in terms of speaking to what we can do beyond just the consumer level, there's a lot to be said about policy work, about grassroots power building. And Sandra, you talked on the idea of cultural erasure. And so I think another very valid conversation we could have as what we can do as forms of resistance is cultural revitalization. I think the project of fast fashion in many ways is tied to homogeneity. And I mean that both in cultural identity, how we dress, but also agricultural systems. When we have, cash cropping, monocropping of single fibers and textiles, I feel like so much, even in the sustainable fashion world, the conversation has stopped on what's the most sustainable fiber, linen, cotton, whatever. And I feel like these conversations erase the context that is necessary for sustainability. When we are going towards a future that's rooted in land-based, localized economies, it's not about what is the most XYZ, it's what's regional to that location, looking at the histories and specifics. And that's tied to indigeneity in many ways. So I think that's important to know. So another thing people can look into is local fiber sheds. But Sandra, I also love that you mentioned the idea of this feeling of there is no alternative, which is literally an acronym that we've seen in global economics, TINA, there is no alternative, which was championed by people like Margaret Thatcher. The idea that, I forget who said it, but we can imagine the end of the world before we imagine the end of capitalism. So I think in many ways, this conversation lends itself to the very radical and necessary work of political reimagination. One divests from seeing women, especially women of color globally, tied purely to their labor, seeing garment workers as the true artisans as they are, seeing fashion as the art it is rather than a disposable commodity. So all of this ties into a cognitive shift, and there are very real things we can do in our day-to-day lives, but I encourage people to just think of the ways that we've been conditioned into a very mechanistic worldview and how things should operate and what our role is in the larger system, going beyond framing individual action versus systemic change, like the stark dichotomy, because our individual actions can very much help materialize the world we want to see when we think about our work as consumers, not just citizens, or as citizens, not just consumers.
To go off that, Aditi, that's exactly what I was thinking too, is that we are byproducts of a capitalistic first society. And there is this notion that society tells us we need to be buying. Our consumer level has been so exponential in this one generation versus even my parents' generation, and that has been infiltrated by the rise of social media and technology and the rise of red carpet style and all of that in the West. And the notion that we need to have a new outfit every day for Instagram, we need to have a new outfit every time we go out, like that is actually what we need to reframe. A lot of people are saying what can we do? And it's not about, it's sustainability, yes, needs to be accessible, but it's also, we need to reframe our own internal minds of conscious and subconsciously of why we're byproducts of this capitalistic first society, and asking ourselves, every time we feel validated by a purchase or shopping therapy or anything that's glamorized in the West, like that all comes from capitalism itself. And that's the internal mind shift we need to kind of change. I mean, during the pandemic in 2020, when there was a lockdown, when we would only go shopping once a week for groceries, we were very intentional about it. And that's what needs to continue. Like everyone before the pandemic said that human behavior would be so hard to change, but we saw human behavior change in just a matter of seconds with just 1 week and on a global level. So when we need to continue that kind of intentionality as we move forward into a world that opens back up again. When we go grocery shopping, we would make a list of everything we need. We would know that we would very intentionally go to our local grocery store or order it. And before in New York, you could swipe your credit card, you could tap your thumb and be buying, 10 times a day without even realizing. It just became a mechanism that we were then these consumer robots, but we got back into our humanity of what consumerism actually means, the intentionality behind it. And that's what we need to bring into as we move forward and the world opens up. It's almost reshifting and reframing our own internal mindsets first that will then contribute to the macro level changes.
Okay, can I just jump in for a second? Lena? Okay, so I want to be a little bit of a devil's advocate, and I think that always makes the conversation more interesting. So I agree with you. We have to change our, purchasing behavior in the West, because that's where most of the goods are coming. Again, I know the facts from Bangladesh, 60% of the garments go to EU markets, 40% to US. So, it is a $34 billion industry now. It has given these women access to money. It has also allowed them to invest in their children's education, put a roof over their head, pay for their parents' healthcare, etc. And it is important to change this behavior. But at the same time, what are the alternatives for these women? As demand shrinks, right? You also have to not just shrink demand, you have to think about what would be the alternative jobs that could be created. You have, to take this example that I know best, 4 million women in the city working in various factories, right? Again, as I mentioned, they do not want to work in factories, but those are the skills they have, and that's what they're doing. So what would be the alternative? So I think it's not a one point solution, right? It has to, you also have to think about, well, how do we bring these, women up and give them a sustainable life, right? Otherwise, we are again perpetuating a colonial relationship. Hey, I'm not going to feel, bad about myself, so I'm not going to purchase anything for 6 months. We could do that, our parents, I grew up that way. I didn't get too many clothes when I was growing up, and I was fine. But it's going to have an impact. So the thing, I think you have to also think, well, what can we do to create jobs for them, right? And I don't know that answer, but I want to put it out there because we have not talked about it.
I think if I can spring in here too, this is what I was trying to get at with this notion of sacrifice zones. And I think of the people I know in the villages in North Sumatra. There's land degradation, there is policy, national policy, whereby they earn too little from their agricultural work. And then, they're more or less forced to leave, go to the city. Of course, there's the carrot and the stick. There is some carrot, but there's a lot of stick. And that's why this issue of the fashion industry providing jobs, yeah, it looks like we're being generous in buying clothes and giving work. But if you take a look at it in that larger systemic whole, it's the fashion industry is taking advantage of the sacrifices that are made elsewhere in the colonial system. And there has to be an awful lot of repair happening in the world so that people can stay home.
Thank you so much, Sandra, for your input. We are almost out of time. We only had really time for 1 or 2 Q&A questions, but hopefully at some point we can pick up this, this amazing discussion and be in the same panel again or the same Zoom again at some point. So I will make the closing remarks and thank everybody for coming to this panel event. So as we conclude this event, we are very hopeful that those of you watching will push forth the importance of ensuring the decolonization of our fashion industry and utilize civil society's paramount role in forming discussion and working with the private and government sectors in policy regulation that protects the millions of women and girls held captive to colonial relationships within our international political economy. Just to emphasize, our private sector and government sector have the most capacity, especially the private sector, to combat the exploitative nature. So we as individuals have a responsibility to change the habits within our daily lives, like recycling and shopping for sustainable brands, but also putting the pressure on the people that have the capacity to actually implement legal framework around changing and decolonizing the fashion industry. So within our global and local fashion supply chains, everybody deserves upward socioeconomic mobility and the pursuit of happiness. And we can start that by ensuring women and girl garment workers have a living wage and good working conditions. I'd like to thank all of our amazing panel speakers for sharing their perspectives and insights on a pressing topic that, like I said before, does not get enough attention. Our panel members have given us a great understanding onto the detrimental realities of fast fashion and the steps that we can take through our voices to demand the implementation of regulations and legal framework that protects women and girls. A special thanks also to the NGO Committee on Human Rights for being a co-sponsor, and Palab Saha and Claire Haas, who were students that helped draft the questions for the Q&A session, which we sadly did not have enough time to go through all of them. But if you'd like to find out more about our panel members and resources for decolonizing the fashion industry, we will be sending out an end program for this panel event next week. So thank you so much, everybody, for joining and taking the time to be part of this discussion. So thank you.